I inherited 70 acres of land the day my father died, but 3 nights later, I discovered a hidden tunnel beneath the property. And at the bottom of that tunnel, I found the man I had buried 6 months earlier waiting for me with a truth that could destroy an entire town. At the time, though, I had no idea any of that was coming. All I knew was that the phone rang on a quiet Wednesday morning while I sat at the kitchen table staring at a bowl of cereal I hadn't touched. My name is Noah Hale, and 6 months before that call, I watched my father lowered into the ground at a cemetery outside Cleveland. My dad, Marcus Hale, had been a quiet man all his life. He worked construction, came home tired, paid the bills when he could, and avoided talking about his past like it was something dangerous. Growing up, whenever I asked where he came from or why we had no relatives nearby, he would just shrug and say, "Some places are better left behind." So when the voice on the phone introduced himself as an attorney from a town called Silver Ridge, Wyoming, I assumed he had the wrong number. "I'm looking for Noah Hale," the man said in a careful voice. "Son of Marcus Hale." I remember gripping the edge of the table because hearing my father's name out loud still felt strange after the funeral, like someone opening a door to a room I wasn't ready to walk into yet. "That's me," I said slowly. There was a pause on the line. "Your father left you an inheritance," the attorney continued. 70 acres of farmland just outside Silver Ridge. I actually laughed out loud at that. My father had spent most of his life barely keeping us afloat financially. The idea that he owned 70 acres anywhere sounded ridiculous. But the lawyer didn't laugh. Instead, he calmly explained that the land had been in my father's name for more than 20 years, that taxes had been paid every year without fail, and that according to the will, I was now the sole owner. I hung up the phone feeling like the floor had shifted beneath my feet. My Uncle Ray, my dad's old friend who had been helping take care of me since the funeral, drove me to Wyoming 3 days later so we could see the property ourselves. The trip took almost 15 hours, and the whole way there I kept wondering why my father had never once mentioned this place. Not a word, not even a hint. When we finally turned off the highway onto a narrow gravel road surrounded by tall grass and pine trees, the sky was stretching wide and blue over hills that seemed to roll forever. Then the farmhouse came into view at the end of the road. It was old, 2 stories with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. But it stood stubbornly against the wind like it had been waiting a long time for someone to come back. The land stretched far beyond it. Fields, a rusted barn, a broken fence line disappearing toward the hills. 70 acres of silence and secrets my father had carried his whole life without telling me. The lawyer met us on the porch. His name was Daniel Grayson, a thin man in a brown suit that looked slightly too big for him. He handed me a heavy ring of keys and said quietly, "Your father was very specific in his instructions." "Instructions?" I asked. He nodded and pulled a folded piece of paper from his briefcase. "The property is yours, free and clear. But your father wrote something in his will." He unfolded the page and read aloud. "Noah must never sell the land, under any circumstances." Uncle Ray gave a small chuckle behind me. "That's a strange request," he said. I thought so too. Why would my dad care whether I sold land he had never even told me about? Before I could ask more questions, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed across the yard. A black SUV rolled slowly up the driveway and stopped near the porch. The man who stepped out looked like he belonged in a city office tower, not in the middle of rural Wyoming. He was tall, maybe in his early 60s, with silver hair and a smile that seemed polite on the surface but cold underneath. "You must be Noah Hale," he said as he climbed the steps toward me. "Victor Langford. I run Langford Development." His handshake was firm and lingering. "I knew your father years ago," he continued smoothly, glancing out at the fields like a man inspecting property he already owned. "I've been trying to buy this land for a very long time." Uncle Ray's ears perked up immediately. "Really?" Langford nodded and turned his attention back to me. "I'll make this simple. I'll offer you $400,000 for the entire property. Cash." My uncle actually let out a low whistle. $400,000 was more money than I had ever seen in my life. But something about the way Langford said it, like he expected me to accept immediately, made my stomach twist. I looked out across the fields again. The wind moved through the tall grass in slow waves, and for some reason the land didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching me, waiting. "I'll need time to think about it," I said. Langford's smile stayed on his face, but something colder flickered behind his eyes. "Don't take too long," he replied quietly. "Opportunities like this disappear quickly." Then he turned, climbed back into his SUV, and drove away in a cloud of dust that hummed over the driveway long after he was gone. That night, after Uncle Ray fell asleep on the couch, I walked through the farmhouse alone. The place smelled like old wood and dust, and something faintly familiar I couldn't quite name. My father had lived here once, maybe long ago before I was born. When I stepped into the upstairs bedroom, a strange feeling washed over me like I had just walked into someone else's memories. The moonlight coming through the window fell across the wooden floorboards, and that's when I noticed one of them looked slightly different from the others, scratched along the edges like it had been lifted before. My heart started pounding as I knelt down and pried it loose with my fingers. Beneath the floorboard was a small metal box wrapped in cloth. Inside was a rusted iron key, a folded map of the hills surrounding the farm, and a single handwritten note in my father's unmistakable handwriting. I stared at those words for a long time before the meaning sank in. Because the note didn't explain the key. It didn't explain the map. It didn't explain the land. It only said one thing: trust no one, not even Ray. Asterisk, asterisk, and suddenly the 70 acres my father left me didn't feel like an inheritance at all. It felt like the beginning of something dangerous he had been hiding his entire life. 3 nights after I found my father's note hidden beneath the floorboards, I uncovered the secret buried under the 70 acres he left me. And what I found down there made me question everything I thought I knew about the man I had buried 6 months earlier. At first I tried to ignore the message: trust no one, not even Ray. Asterisk, asterisk, I kept telling myself it had to mean something from long ago, something that didn't apply anymore. Uncle Ray had been helping me ever since my dad's funeral. He was the one who drove with me all the way to Wyoming to see the property. But the more I thought about it, the stranger everything felt. My father had secretly owned 70 acres of land for 20 years and never told me. He had paid the taxes every year and then written in his will that I must never sell it. That wasn't normal. That meant the land mattered for some reason. The next afternoon, I unfolded the map I had found in the metal box. Most of it showed the farm and the surrounding hills, but one spot behind the barn had been circled in red ink. Next to it, my father had written 2 words: Old Well. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked behind the barn, pushing through tall weeds until I saw the stone ring rising from the ground. The well looked abandoned. Rotten boards covered the opening, and vines wrapped around the stones like the place had been forgotten for years. But when I moved the boards aside and shined my flashlight down into it, I felt my stomach tighten. There was no water. Instead, an iron ladder had been bolted into the stone wall, leading down into darkness. Walls aren't supposed to have ladders. I stood there for a long moment, debating whether I should go back to the house. But my father had circled this place on the map. That meant he wanted me to find it. So I grabbed the ladder and started climbing down. The metal creaked under my weight as I descended deeper underground. 20 feet down, my boots finally hit solid ground. I expected dirt at the bottom, but instead I stepped onto a concrete floor. A narrow tunnel stretched out ahead of me. Wooden beams supported the walls, and old electrical wires ran along the ceiling. Someone had built this place. I walked slowly through the tunnel, my flashlight cutting through the dust-filled air. That's when I heard something that made me freeze. A sound, soft and uneven, like someone breathing. At first I thought it had to be the wind echoing from above. But then I heard it again, followed by a weak cough deeper in the tunnel. My heart started racing. I should have climbed back out immediately. Instead, I kept moving forward until I reached a rusted steel door at the end of the passage. The lock looked ancient, and suddenly I remembered the iron key from the box upstairs. My hands were shaking as I pulled it from my pocket and slid it into the lock. The key turned with a loud click. Slowly, I pushed the door open. My flashlight swept across a small underground room. There was a table, dusty shelves, and a narrow cot against the wall. And sitting on that cot was a thin man shielding his eyes from the light. For a moment, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. Because the man staring back at me had the same gray hair, the same tired eyes, and the same scar above his eyebrow I remembered from childhood. My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Dad?" The man blinked slowly at the light. Then he looked straight at me. "Noah," he said hoarsely. My heart slammed against my chest. I had watched this man's coffin lowered into the ground 6 months earlier. I had stood beside Uncle Ray at the funeral. Yet somehow Marcus Hale, My father was alive in a hidden room beneath the land he left me. He slowly stood, gripping the table for balance, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Fear. Then he said the words that shattered everything I believed. "The man they buried," he said quietly, "wasn't me." The moment my father said the man in the coffin wasn't him, the world I thought I understood completely fell apart. I stood there in that underground room staring at him, my mind racing through the memory of the funeral, the closed casket, Uncle Ray's hand on my shoulder while the priest finished the prayer. "That's not possible," I finally said, my voice shaking. My father slowly sat back down on the cot, looking older and more exhausted than I had ever seen him. "I didn't fake my death for no reason," he said quietly. "Victor Langford has been trying to get this land for years because of what's under it." My stomach tightened. "Under it?" He nodded toward the tunnel behind me. "This whole system leads to an old mining deposit. Rare minerals worth millions. Langford found out decades ago and started buying land around here. But he couldn't get this farm because it's the only access point." Suddenly Langford's huge offer made sense. My father explained that when Langford realized he wouldn't sell, things became dangerous. Threats started. Strange people watching the house. So my father created a plan. With help from someone he trusted, he staged his death using the body of a man who had died without family in another town. The funeral happened. Everyone believed it. And he disappeared underground to protect the land until he could be sure Langford gave up. "But Ray," I said slowly. My father's expression darkened. "Ray was never my friend," he replied. "He worked for Langford. That's why I warned you." Right then, the sound of a vehicle echoed faintly from above the tunnel. My father looked toward the ladder and whispered, "They're here." We climbed up the well quietly and stepped out into the moonlit field just as headlights swept across the farmyard. Ray's voice carried through the night. "Noah, you out here?" My father grabbed my arm and pulled me behind the barn. From there we could see Ray standing beside Victor Langford near the house. "Kid probably found the tunnel by now," Ray said. Langford smiled calmly. "Good," he replied. "That saves us the trouble." My father stepped out from behind the barn before I could stop him. "Looking for me, Victor?" Langford's face went completely pale. For the first time, the powerful man looked terrified. My father had secretly recorded their entire conversation using equipment hidden in the tunnel for years. When the police arrived later that night, called by a message my father had scheduled days earlier, Langford and Ray were both arrested for fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy connected to illegal mining operations across the county. Weeks later, the investigation proved everything my father had said was true. The mineral deposit under the farm was real, and because the land belonged to us, the rights did too. But my father never cared about the money. One evening we stood together on the porch watching the wind move across the 70 acres he had protected for 20 years. "I just wanted to make sure it stayed yours," he told me. And after everything that happened, I finally understood that the strange inheritance he left me was never really about land at all. It was about trust, survival, and the truth buried beneath the surface waiting for the right moment to be uncovered.